Welcome to a new series of Churchill, the Finest Half Hour.
We're taking you up close and personal with this towering historical figure.
When Winston Churchill died in 1965, one man seemed closer to him than almost anyone else.
His doctor, Lord Moran, the man who had accompanied him through the war, illness, and political crises.
But within a year, Moran would become one of the most controversial figures in Churchill's story,
because he published a deeply personal account of Churchill's physical and mental decline,
including the now infamous story of the Black Dog.
How reliable was Moran, and did he really understand his patient at all?
Join us for some answers here on Churchill, the Finest Half Hour.
Welcome to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Dr. Warren Doctor, and joining me as ever is Professor Richard Toye, the Dr. Jekyll to my Mr. Hyde.
Or Jekyll, PhD, as I like to think. Now, we're talking today about, I guess, for anybody who's got a collection of Churchill books, this one is going to be on the shelf. This is Churchill, The Struggle for Survival by Lord Moran, the former Charles Wilson. And we can start the story at the other end, if you like, 1965, when Churchill is on his deathbed. And at the age of 90, there's a death watch in the media, and there's a figure who is there sort of always giving information to the press. And this was the guy we mentioned, Lord Moran, who had been Churchill's main physician or doctor for, at this point, 25 years.
That's right. And number one, I think we should just pause here for a second and say this whole series, we're looking at people who arguably knew Churchill the best or he spent his most time with. We're starting out with Lord Charles Moran, who was by Churchill all the time, and one even gets a feeling that he's liked being close to the limelight, I think, which we'll explore later. But he was with Churchill all the time. He was with him through the Blitz. He even traveled with him. He went with him to Tehran. He went with him to Yalta. But in spending that much time with Churchill, of course, as any physician would, he kept notes of the medical condition that Churchill was in. And because he understood perhaps the historical moment, he also kept a very extensive diary about Churchill. And not all of it was necessarily appealing, or would certainly not be appealing to the Churchill family.
Right. So, I mean, this is obviously at the moment of Churchill's death and funeral, there's not only a British national celebration and mourning of Churchill, there's to a great extent a global mourning as well. And that his reputation stands perhaps at its highest point because very few people are going to say bad things about him. And so when Moran's book comes out in 1966, really pretty speedily after Churchill's death, it is in many ways a shock and to many people an outrage.
So, I mean, one of the things that came out in this controversial diary that he released, this memoir, which, by the way, was heavily edited from where he began, he discussed things like the Black Dog, which, of course, any Churchill scholar is very familiar with. So in this controversial book, Charles Moran is also the first person to really put out the idea that Churchill suffered from significant depression. Churchill himself sort of famously called it his Black Dog, and it's something that really haunted him. And this is one of the things that comes out of Moran's writing, and it has shaped the way even historians think about Winston Churchill. For instance, William Manchester's biography of Churchill heavily foregrounds Churchill's depression and even argues to a degree that this is one of the things that shapes his whole character.
Absolutely. Now, as we'll come back to, there's an argument that Moran himself had taken some relatively casual comments by Churchill and blown them out of proportion. But as you say, from somebody who had been obviously presented sometimes in a very simplistically heroic way to, at this stage in the 60s, the idea that a major world leader had suffered from depression was both fascinating and disturbing to quite a lot of people.
Yeah, as a result of this book coming, basically the whole British medical establishment completely condemned Moran for this as a breach of ethics. I mean, this is all patient-doctor confidentiality, and you could see that the Churchill family was outraged. They called it a betrayal. They were horrified at how open and unpolished Moran presents Winston Churchill, particularly later on in life. But I I think that it would have been unthinkable in the 1960s that one of the men who's wielded arguably the greatest amount of power in the 20th century was also suffering from mental health issues. So you can imagine that this is a real issue when this book comes out.
Well, I mean, I get my therapy from talking to you about Churchill, but let's dive back into Moran's personal history. Let's call him Moran. He was born Charles Wilson. He's ennobled, given a peerage, becomes Lord Moran during the war. He was born in 1882. He was the son of a GP, a general practitioner. His father steers him into medicine, but it's World War One, which is really fundamental for shaping his career, both as a man and as a theorist about medicine and psychology, and also as a writer.
Right. And I mean, I just want to touch on that real quick because actually, even though his father forces him to become a doctor, I think his first passion was probably for writing. And that's one of the things that we'll see comes up quite a lot in his career, even prior to meeting Churchill. But I think you're right, Richard, to focus on his experience in the First World War. He had joined the Royal Army Medical Corps, and he actually concealed his higher qualification so he could go to the front. And then for over 2 years, he was in the trenches. He witnessed the horrors of warfare. He served with the 1st Battalion Royal Fusiliers, and he was awarded the Military Cross at the Somme in 1916 and was actually even awarded an Italian Silver Medal for valor in 1917.
And he also, and I think this is setting him up later for observing Churchill, because he becomes obsessed with men's minds in warfare and watching who breaks under the strain, who endures. And he has this theory that courage is like a form of capital. So it's a finite resource that men sort of spent until they ran out of it, until they'd worn it out. And he publishes this book, The Anatomy of Courage, not until 1945, but with Churchill's encouragement, but it's based on this earlier experience.
But the point is that he's taking psychiatric medicine very seriously in an age when not everyone did, and the effects on these men who served in the trenches and how it completely disrupted their lives after the fact. And so this is clearly something he's observing the whole time. But the real power in Charles Moran is what he did after the war. And so he was able, I think he returned to St. Mary's Hospital. And what he did there as an administrator is really remarkable because he transformed St. Mary's Hospital from a decrepit educational institution into a premier medical school. He was a master of medical politics. He was often able to get funding. He became the president of the Royal College of Physicians in 1941, which is a post that he held for 9 years, which is really remarkable, particularly during the Second World War. So he's a very capable administrator and political player. But I think one of the things that we need to talk about is his actual character. Churchill liked to surround himself with men who were cavalier, people like Lord Beaverbrook or the Prof. I can't think of his name.
Yeah, Lord Charwell, as he became.
Yeah, Lord Charwell. Yeah, men who were characters. Yeah. And Lord Moran was not necessarily a character. In fact, he was, if the others were cavaliers, he was a roundhead. He was monkish, plain eating. He didn't drink completely down the line, didn't smoke.
He did allow himself a single glass of sherry to stimulate the flow of gastric juice, which it does. I mean, I'm sure that's very scientific, and I'm going to take that as a medical recommendation from now on.
Well, I've got to say, I have limited myself to a very moderate selection of breakfast wines in the morning. So I understand where he's coming from as a doctor myself.
And so it is 24th of May, 1940, and Churchill has been Prime Minister for only 2 weeks, and the Nazis are tearing through France. Lord Beaverbrook, you mentioned, his good friend, the sort of press proprietor, Brendan Bracken, MP, thought to be another crony of Churchill. They think that Churchill is under so much strain, he hasn't got a regular doctor, and they want somebody to keep an eye on him. And Wilson was really sort of their choice.
And as I say, he's an unusual choice. You can't imagine Winston picking him, but it makes a lot of sense that you could imagine his cronies, like Brendan Bracken and Lord Beaverbrook and others, saying, no, we need somebody who's serious. We need a straight man to keep an eye on Winston's health because he's the keystone to what we're trying to do here in the war. And you can imagine the stress at this time. And I can only hope, Richard, that years from now, when I'm president, people will refer to you as my crony in a similar fashion.
Well, I have to start keeping a diary. Going to be my meal ticket in due course, which actually is a serious point about Moran, who, from the point where he is appointed, clearly starts making very, very careful notes on Churchill. And he certainly develops relatively early on, I think, the sort of the notion that this might in due course lead to some publishable work. And so that probably wasn't sort of what Churchill was expecting when he took him on as a doctor. And he does certainly confide in Moran. To what extent is a bit debatable, but
Right.
they are very, as you mentioned earlier, they're together a lot of the time. He starts to accompany Churchill on his major overseas trips. He's there in Moscow, for example, twice, and he is not only talking to Churchill, he's talking to the people around Churchill. And so I guess the enjoyment of the book, or the promise of the book that he publishes, is this up close and personal account, which doesn't only give trivia about what Churchill ate for breakfast, it is casting light on his thoughts about political issues, right?
Right. And because he obviously Churchill would muse on politics around everyone all the time. And I do just to say, I think, but I do think it's interesting that other people, for instance, Sir John Colville was Churchill's private secretary during this time. Colville, he says that Moran was seldom, if ever, present when history was made, but he was often invited to the dinner afterwards. And so it's very clear that Colville always felt like Lord Moran was overplaying his hand a bit, and that he was probably given more emphasis than he deserved.
Exactly. And again, what exercised Colville as well was this concept of the black dog, Churchill's depression or alleged depression. So let's take a deep dive into that issue after the break. Welcome back to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Professor Richard Toye, and with me is Dockter, and we're talking about a doctor, specifically Churchill's doctor, Lord Moran, and his book, Winston Churchill, The Struggle for Survival.
And one of the things that came out in his book, much to the chagrin of everyone, was this idea of Churchill and the myth of the black dog, which is what Churchill famously called his depression, the black dog. And so there's lots that's been written about this.
Yes. So, for example, August 14th, 1944, in his book, Moran presents what he says is a diary entry of Churchill ruminating on his youth. He says, allegedly, Churchill said, "When I was young, for 2 or 3 years, the light faded out of the picture. I did my work, but black depression settled on me. It helped me to talk to Clemmy about it. I don't like standing near the edge of a platform when an express train is passing through. A second's action would end everything."
It really is shocking to imagine Churchill saying that. And lots has been written about whether or not Churchill actually suffered from depression. And there have been lots of subsequent articles really take a medical deep dive on whether or not Churchill suffered from prolonged depression or not.
Yeah, and also the argument that rather than being depressed, Churchill had some anxiety disorder, that he didn't want to throw himself in front of a train. He just had some anxiety that he might suddenly, spontaneously, do something that would put himself in danger, and that he uses painting, which he takes up in the First World War, as a way of soothing himself and coping with this latching on to particular worries and ideas and obsessing about them. I don't think we should totally dismiss the black dog, because Churchill did actually use that, because we see that confirmed in a letter that he writes in July 1911. So Moran certainly didn't invent the idea that he used those words, but in that letter, which I just mentioned, Churchill writes that the black dog was quite away from me now. All the colours came back into the picture. I suggest that rather than it being as semi-permanent condition. This was something which it cropped up now and again.
And it's difficult to know fully a man's mind. I mean, one of another return of the Black Dog, although I don't think he's explicitly talked about that, is when he lost his daughter.
Yes, Marigold Churchill's very young infant daughter tragically died in 1921.
I mean, of course you would be depressed. I mean, that's grief. He suffered from grief, but that isn't clinical depression. And so I think it's important to finesse how we discuss it. And one of the things that really raises Moran here is that he frames it all in this depressive lens, which really brings into light, like, exactly how accurate are your diary entries, right?
So, I mean, let's think about the diary, because I think it's also worth saying that the shock when the book was published, it wasn't just about the mental health, it was about Churchill's physical condition as well. And we did talk in our series about Churchill and Roosevelt about this famous episode in 1941 where Churchill is staying at the White House and suffers a heart attack, and Moran essentially decides to keep this from the world, but to keep careful notes of it, which he then sort of later on uses in his book. And of course, we do know that Churchill did suffer from genuine ill health, which clearly did worsen over time. He did have strokes. We don't have to rely on Moran for this. We know that various times in World War II, of course, it was perfectly public that he was suffering from conditions like pneumonia at various points. The world was aware that these conditions were real, but nevertheless, to have it sort of so remorselessly laid out kind of year after year, and clearly so the point was that this taken together could suggest that Churchill was not really as capable as he might have been during the war itself. And so it's really by Moran's own account, he is concealing from the world at large the seriousness of some of Churchill's conditions. And so coming back to the book itself and how reliable it is, clearly a lot of it is based on contemporary notes and things which he wrote near the time, and then other stuff which he'd written years later, and he mashed it all together in a literary sense very successfully. But it's not the same as Colville's diary or many other diaries where you can be pretty sure if it says 24th of May 1940, that diary entry really was written then on the day and wasn't subsequently muddled around with.
But Lord Moran's diary, I mean, in future, there are several instances where stuff didn't line up. Even his son later, the second Lord Moran, basically said that a lot of his father's work involved considerable retrospective editing. Dates were frequently wrong. And for instance, one of the really interesting things is that Lord Moran claimed in his work that Churchill went to see his neurologist, who was hilariously called Lord Brain, that he first saw him in May 1950. But we know from Lord Brain's actual reports and notes that he was able to prove that he saw Churchill in October 1949. So when you see a true diarist versus someone who's retrospectively editing things, it raises a lot of questions as a primary source.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm going to ever so slightly defend Moran here, or defend the book, insofar as he clearly was making copious notes and thinking very hard about this over a period of 25 years. I do think that some of the diary entries are genuine ones, although working out which ones is sometimes a bit of a challenge. And so I would say that if you were to treat it as a very detailed memoir, it is probably closer to an accurate record than politicians, for example, who sometimes, don't keep any papers, don't keep any notes, and then retrospectively write down everything that they think happened.
Right. You just have to, as a historian, you just have to treat it a little more cautiously. But I agree with you. It's so much better than just a retrospective memoir written by a politician. I mean, because it is so candid, and you do get, I think, full glimpses and full visions of Churchill the man in this. So I'm not trying to condemn this book at all. In fact, I have found his book to be incredibly useful in understanding Churchill's mind, particularly after the war and into his second government.
I agree, and I've been looking at it recently, for example, for the Moscow Conference of 1942, and there are some great details in there. Is that they're in this Soviet villa where there's a guest house, and Moran is bringing his stuff in, and he kind of hears this scream from upstairs, and he goes upstairs. Churchill is in the bath. Churchill can't figure out how to use the taps, and he's sitting there in freezing water, and Moran, well, I'll try this way, I'll shoot some more freezing water directly onto Churchill's sensitive areas, shall we say. And I can't really believe that Moran just made this stuff up, right? I think that stuff is legit.
Yeah.
Which may seem trivial, but also what he's doing is that he's clearly talking to the other people who were actually at some of these meetings and making detailed records of it. And a lot of it does match up with the official records of the meetings. He's clearly, because he's wanting to write a book, being very careful to gather as much information as he can when he's not getting it firsthand.
Right. But that also raises questions about how he got that information. And one of the reasons I think he was roundly condemned when he published this book is that he was a jerk to people around Churchill. He was accused of gratuitous insensitivity. He would often quote other doctors like Lord Moran without their permission. And so other diarists and other people who were close to Churchill had really negative views of Lord Moran.
Yeah. I mean, you wouldn't want him not to have written the book.
Right.
You might have wanted him to be a bit clearer about his methodology, but then that's a historian's complaint, isn't it, really? So I suppose we should come on to the publication of the book, which is in 1966. The family, as we mentioned earlier, were outraged, and Randolph Churchill writes his letter to the Times, published on April 30th of that year, and he is really scathing about what Moran has decided to do.
Yes, so he writes, while nurses, secretaries, and soldiers had written about his father as well, no solicitors or civil servants had written or had broken with the traditions of their profession. He goes on to say about Lord Moran seems to have been the first doctor, at least in this country, to have blazed the trail. I think in the general interest that he should not establish a precedent. So, I mean, he's basically utterly condemning this. And you could imagine why he would.
Yeah, I mean, his argument is that Churchill deserved to be treated with the same medical confidentiality that anybody else would. And I mean, we could certainly understand why the family felt this way.
But I do think it's important for us to remember, as historians, in Moran's defense, he is writing for history. I mean, he's trying to provide, albeit maybe slightly skewed or whatever, a record of what he witnessed.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, he himself is at quite an advanced age by this point, but he lives several years more, and he defends himself. So he tells the Times it is not possible to follow the last 25 years of Sir Winston's life without a knowledge of his medical background. Only a doctor can give the facts accurately. And he claimed that he had written with Churchill's knowledge, although he didn't really claim to have formal permission. And his argument, although I think this is one of those slightly, do you really think so type argument, that
Yeah.
knowing what Churchill was really like up close would only enhance his reputation. Now, in fairness, in order for Churchill to have a reputation, to have people discussing him many years after his death, then actually if everybody had just said he was fantastic unequivocally, then that would be quite boring. And that
Yeah.
what people need to have a reputation actually is to have people arguing pro and contrary points of view, as we're doing now. And so, although in some ways the book does not always make Churchill look good, it certainly ensured that he would continue to be debated, or helped ensure that he would be debated for years to come.
No, I agree. And I think as we consider the legacy of Lord Moran and what we all think, is that I do think Churchill was probably aware that Moran was writing a book. I do think Churchill himself would have been horrified at things in the book, but I think he was aware. And I think also Churchill would have liked Moran to be somewhat controversial, not this controversial, because Churchill understood the power of having people debate his legacy, like you say. And it's one of the things that you could see going all the way back to his knowledge of how to work the British press and how to have himself caricatured a particular way, i.e. the cigar. was to have people talk about the negative, the vices that he had. One of those things famously is drinking. And I think Lord Moran talks about his drinking, although I think he doesn't let on that Churchill was some kind of an alcoholic or anything. Although I do think Churchill certainly drank a lot, and I think I can tell you historically that we would call him an alcoholic today by our own judgment. But I do think that Churchill would have wanted people to think maybe he drank too much as a part of his persona.
That is very true. He did this thing where we mentioned Lord Charwell earlier on, Frederick Lindemann, as he'd formerly been, the Prof, as he was known. And
Yeah.
Churchill sort of did this thing as a sort of regular, almost party piece. When he was sitting in a railway carriage, he'd say, "Look, Prof, every day for the last 40 years or something, I've drunk half a bottle of champagne. How far would that fill up this railway carriage?" And then the Prof would sort of get out his
He'd do
slide
the
rule,
math, yeah.
would do all these calculations, and he'd say, "Well, it would come up to the middle of our thighs." And then Churchill would be really disappointed that it wasn't more than that.
Yeah.
So in terms of bringing it back to Moran certainly from time to time told him that he ought to lay off the drink for health reasons. He wasn't saying you're dependent on it and so on. So I don't think Churchill would have minded people knowing. I mean, that was part of his image that he liked brandy, etc., etc. And I think that he also knew that lots of people around him were making notes of his side comments on all sorts of things, his witticisms or his observations. He was aware that people were doing that and probably relished that to some extent. I think he would have been disturbed by the depth and the detail and the extent of the comments on his physical health. I think probably would also have disputed the claims about his mental health as well, although that said, the patient isn't necessarily always the best person to say exactly what the condition of their own mental health is.
No, I think in particular, Churchill would have had an issue with the black dog because that challenged the persona I was talking about, the heavy drinking, borderline gluttonous appetites for food and for booze and for cigars and all that. I mean, one of my favorite stories in Churchill's second administration, and I've forgotten the context and the date on this, but there was a vote that had to go overnight. And of course, the rumors were that Churchill was old. How was he going to get through this thing? And then in the morning, Churchill had an enormous breakfast with breakfast wines and this very bibulous breakfast like a buffet, and encouraged the press to come in and eat and drink with them. And he was, of course, totally rejuvenated because he had actually gone and taken a nap while everyone else was doing the work. And so he presented himself as this guy who loved everything and took in everything. And so then to suffer from a type of depression would have been contrary to the persona Churchill was trying to portray. And I think he would have found the black dog things, that was private. That ought not to have been shared. I would have.
Yeah. And I suppose it certainly is true that in the last years of his life, after he'd stood down as Prime Minister, at the point where his mental capacity clearly was declining, then Churchill did, understandably, somebody thrived on activity. He did, I think, lapse into a form of depression, but of course that's quite different from saying that this was what affected his judgment at the crucial point where he was determining the fate of Britain during World War II.
Right. I mean, particularly after his children started passing while he was still here in the last years of his life, we certainly know that Churchill had a very difficult time. That leaves a final question for our podcast is, what about Lord Moran? Was he this truth fighter for history, or was he also just a scoundrel trying to get his name out there? What do we think? Where do we land? Are we thumbs up or thumbs down on Lord Moran?
Well, we're glad he wrote the book.
Very glad.
We're very glad he wrote the book. I mean, I think that he was somebody who used his position to his own advantage, to his own reputation in the end, that he exploited his closeness to Churchill to put himself in the historical record. So I think that you can, from sort of medical ethics point of view, deplore what Moran did. From the historian's point of view, you think, I wouldn't mind if a few more people did this.
Right, yeah, exactly. I've always had a soft spot for Moran because if I was in his shoes, I'm not sure I wouldn't have done something similar. But at the same time, it would have been a portrayal of the family. So, I mean, I think he's a complex figure, just like his patient.
Moran helped create one of the most enduring images of Churchill.
The aging war leader battling depression, exhaustion, and the strain of history itself.
But he also left behind a record filled with contradictions, retrospective editing, and ethical controversy.
Next time, we turn from Churchill's doctor to one of his most important military colleagues,
Field Marshal Allenbrook, whose wartime diaries offer a very different, though equally controversial, portrait of Churchill.
Join us to discover more here on Churchill, the Finest Half Hour.
And in the meantime, KBO.